nọ́mbà wa, àwọn ọmọdé wọ̀nyí kéré sí nọ́mbà wa.
Wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa. Wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa.
Not because I suffer fast, not because I pray and fast. No be your show, no be that. I'm watching. Daily, Osinachi. I'm no kwa, Osinachi. One lemon, Osinachi. I'm watching. Daily, Osinachi. Mama, Osinachi.
Wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa. Wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa. Àwọn ọmọdé wọ̀nyí kéré sí nọ́mbà wa.
Wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa. Wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa.
Not because I suffer fast, not because I pray and fast. No be your show, no be that. I'm watching. Daily, Osinachi. I'm no kwa, Osinachi. One lemon, Osinachi. I'm watching. Daily, Osinachi. Mama, Osinachi.
kéré o, wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa. Wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa, àwọn ọmọdé wọ̀nyí kéré sí nọ́mbà wa.
Wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa. Wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa.
Not because I suffer fast, not because I pray and fast. No be your show, no be jazz. I'm watching. Daily, Osinachi, Namnukwa, Osinachi. One name, Osinachi, I'm watching. Daily, Osinachi, Mama, Osinachi.
Wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa. Wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa. Àwọn ọmọdé wọ̀nyí kéré sí nọ́mbà wa.
A ní wọ́n kéré o, wọ́n kéré o, wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa. Wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa, àwọn ọmọdé wọ̀nyí kéré sí nọ́mbà wa.
Wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa. Wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa.
Not because I suffer fast, not because I pray and fast. No be your show, no be jazz. I'm watching. Daily, Osinachi, Namnukwa, Osinachi. One name, Osinachi, I'm watching. Daily, Osinachi, Mama, Osinachi.
We have 1 minute.
Bookie. Hi, Bookie. Hi, Bossy.
Good morning. Good morning, President.
Good morning.
Good morning, everybody.
Everyone. I think we're just missing Ademide and Bilikis. So hopefully they'll be on here very soon.
So too. Hope so too. Thanks for organizing this session.
Thank
Bossy.
you.
Yeah,
Glad
yeah, I
you
think
did
it was a perfect opportunity for us to continue the conversation.
Yes.
Absolutely. That's a great idea.
I think we have Dr. Adeli joining us.
Hi, everyone. I'm sorry about this. I've been having some challenges with my Wi-Fi.
Oh, okay. Well, glad to have you here. You made it.
It's really early for those of you on the West Coast. I'm impressed. I don't know if I could do it.
5 a.m. probably, right?
5 a.m.
Is it
That's
5
right.
a.m. or 4 a.m.?
It's 5 a.m.
It's
4
5
a.m.
oh,
would
yeah.
be
4 a.m. is when you got up.
4 a.m. is when I got up.
Oh,
But
dear.
actually having to think at 4 a.m. is a different
I know.
beast, right?
Yeah.
I'm actually in Lagos, so luckily for me, it's 1 o'clock in the afternoon.
.com. Okay, recording is now in progress again. And before we begin our conversation at this round table, I want to quickly introduce all of our speakers today. And I'll start with, in roughly alphabetical order of scholars, and then I'll come back to our practitioners. Okay, so I'll start with Ademide Adelusi Adeluyi, who is an assistant professor of history based at University of California, Riverside. She's also the founder of the project New Maps of Old Lagos. Adelusi Adeluyi is a historian of 19th century Lagos. Her research combines an interest in interdisciplinary questions around the use of mapping and even the destruction of old Lagos. She has a forthcoming book titled Imagine Lagos, which addresses the city's 19th century history, rebuilding its past as a series of encounters between men and women, between the past and the present, enslaved and free, and between Eko and Lagos, and also between the land and the lagoon. She teaches classes on African history, urban history, digital storytelling, and historical cartography. Our next speaker in alphabetical order is Dr. Bukola Badegesi, who is based at St. Louis University. She's an associate professor in art history and African American studies. Her research is focused on photography, materiality, transnationalism, the politics of representation, and print culture in Africa and African diasporas. She's currently completing a book titled Picturing Lagos. We've gone from imagining Lagos to picturing Lagos, photography and place in a West African city, 1866 to 1950. Looks very fascinating. Next on our list, we have Professor Kristen Mann of Emory University. Kristen Mann is a professor emerita at Emory University. Her research has focused on Lagos, African and African diaspora history from the 18th through the 20th centuries. Among her books are Marrying Well, Marriage Status and Social Change Among the Educated Elite in Colonial Lagos, classic work, Law in Colonial Africa, Slavery and the Birth of an African City, Lagos, 1760 to 1900, another classic work. She's currently writing a book titled Transatlantic Lives, Slavery and Freedom in West Africa and Brazil, that reconstructs the lives of women and men captured in the 19th century Yoruba wars and enslaved in Africa, Brazil, and Cuba. This will surely be another classic work. Next, we have Susan Rosenfeld, who is received her PhD in African history from the University of California, Los Angeles. She's currently at the University of California, San Diego as a lecturer. And her current book in progress is entitled Assertions of Freedom, Mobility, Kinship, and Liberty Among Afro-Brazilians in Lagos, 1850 to 1900. So we see a lot of overlaps. Um, and finally, on the panel, we also have the director of the Lagos State Records and Archives Bureau, who will be in conversation with this group of historians and art historians. That's Mrs. Bilikis Adebi-Abiola. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to be here. And I look forward to our conversation. A bit about this conversation that we're going to have. It's a continuation of a conversation that started in June of last year, so June of 2021. Last year, Professor Mann reached out to some of us, Mrs. Adebi-Abiola, the new LASREP director, myself, Abosade George, Ademide Adelusi, and Buki Badegesin, for the purpose of facilitating a conversation about better ways to better preserve, manage, and publicize historical records in Lagos State. We had a very rich conversation about the work that each of us was doing individually around Lagos State records. And we started to think about what we might achieve by talking more collaboratively and maybe working more collaboratively in the future. And so this conversation is just part of a series of conversations that we're having about how scholars and practitioners can collaborate more closely in the building of, in archiving Lagos history, so to speak. In my research, I did a bit of research on archives. I feel like I used the word a lot, but I was like, what does it actually mean? According to some superficial research I did online, the archives can be categorized in two different ways. And one was as organic collections, and one was as artificial collections. And organic collections are built as a result of the ongoing work of an individual or an organization. And the materials that are preserved speak to the story being constructed or created naturally in the normal course of the work of that individual or organization. Artificial collections, by contrast, are collections that have been culled by a collector over time. And this could be anything like a map collection, rare books, photographs. And the story that's being constructed is one that is deliberately assembled over time and after the fact of the creation of the object. So in this realm, the archivist is a kind of collector. Historians, like as most of us on this panel are, generally produce organic collections in the normal course of our work. We're always creating outputs, and we have early career and we have late career historians on this panel. So our personal organic collections will vary in size and diversity, but we all surely have them as in part of the normal course of being a historian. You're always looking for records and you're always creating records. But a number of us are also engaged in creating very focused collections, or quote unquote artificial collections. I like focused collections, sounds better. And we have shifted from just using archives as historians, which I think is more the traditional role, and entered in more into the space of archiving as an activity. And in my case, trying to enter into this space without actually having any training in information science. So the question is why? How do we think about this shift in our activity as historians from simply using archives and trying to access archives to now embarking more on curating, collecting, and kind of archiving. So I want to start with that question by asking everyone, what brings you to this conversation on archiving Lagos history? by which I mean, what dimension of archiving Lagos history have you been interested in? And if you can expand on, the work that you have been doing to pursue that interest, right? Is that question clear enough? Thank you. So we'll just, I think we'll go in order of seniority, no, not in order of seniority, starting with Susan.
Thank you for inviting me to the panel and for your introduction. So for me, in terms of what threw me into archiving Lagos, so Kristen Mann and I have worked in very similar archives. So I spent a lot of time in the Lagos State High Court archive that has now sort of much of it has been lost, although I'm sure others can speak to what has been saved from that archive after the fire. So for me, in many ways, I fell into archiving Lagos beyond just my own research by means of that fire that happened. So when I was there in 2014 for my field work, no one had worked in that archive for probably a couple of decades. And when I went, actually, the people who were working in the tower in the High Court, they didn't even realize that there were 19th century documents on the top floor. They had not been up there. So when I went up there, I sort of recatalogued everything as best as I could. Everything was sort of scattered on the ground. And I know Kristen had a similar experience when she was doing research in that archive. But I also started taking pictures of things that I needed for my research, but also sort of whatever I came across, just because it felt like such a precarious archive. And I actually spoke to the head of the High Court about applying for a grant through the British Library for one of these endangered archives grants. But at the time, he wasn't interested, and he, wasn't really interested in collaborating on that. So I basically just went and digitized as much as I could. It still is somewhat disorganized, and I'm, trying to set aside time to sort of look through what I have, because it was papers on the ground, right? They weren't even in volumes anymore of judges' notebooks and things like that. But so it really requires reading through every page to sort of figure out what goes with what. But beyond that, I've collected a significant amount of materials from that archive that are now in a digital format. So I guess I'll stop there for now.
You're muted.
So let's go. Thank you, Susan. Let's go next to Ademide. Thank you.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My internet is a little bit shaky, so if I turn off my camera, it's because I'm trying to maintain my connection to the group. Hello, everyone. This is such a great group to be part of. And I think really important questions that we're seeing reflected in so many other panels. For myself, as a person who started as a graduate student interested in Lagos history, I started with people's bibliographies, people like Kristen Mann, people like Abosede George, and trying to track down some of the materials that they had used in their research. I very quickly found out that outside of, let's say, the confines of the National Archives in the UK and in the British Library, things were disappearing, endangered, or gone. So for instance, I was never able to access anything at the Lagos High Court. I went to Ibadan a number of times to try to see the Herbert Macaulay paper, to see different things. And so for me, as important as it was to be in the, to see the easily archived materials in the UK, I thought it was really important to see what was available in Lagos, in Nigeria, and talk to people. But it was always a series of challenges. And actually what helped me was I've always benefited from the generosity of other scholars who, like Susan or like Halimat or like Kristen or you or Vasudeva, who are able to access things that I may not have been able to see and actually benefited from their generosity with sharing materials. And that really made me realize that if there wasn't enough institutional support to preserve these records that are so important, not just for scholars, but also for Lagosians and others, it would have to be a collaborative effort between scholars and concerned people. So that really, and like Abbas said, I don't have any training, no official kind of training in what it really takes to do this in a non-chaotic and actually organized way that other people can access. So one of the things I've really become interested in is how can I look at the materials I've gathered, the different things I've seen, and also the unexpected places in Lagos, like the National Museum, where they have these incredible archives from, interviews, magazines, and maps, and things like I'm interested in. How can we start to pull this together so that, I get occasional requests from students and I share what I have and other people share things with me, but I don't think it should only be the personal networks of people who we know or who are open to approaching us. I really think that this idea of access should not be limited, especially to those of us who have the privilege of being able to go to different places. I think that as scholars, we have a responsibility to really think about ways to share, maintain, and put this together. And it's been difficult, of course, without support, but I think more of us can benefit, especially the students who are here at the LSA and other places. And so that's how I got into this. I've benefited so much, but I wonder, like, if a person didn't know me or know my work or whatever it is, they wouldn't know what I had, and until my book comes out, inshallah, you're not going to know all the places I've been to. So that's how I got into this, and I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Bukola?
Yes. So yes, again, to repeat what everybody's saying, thank you so much for bringing this conversation back into the fore. So my entry into archiving actually started with my dissertation and trying to kind of figure out what exactly it means to study photography in Lagos or photography anywhere in Nigeria in a historical fashion from like a 19th century, especially because many of the archives that I'm looking at were not really that interested in photography as a material or as a source in and of itself. It was sort of a supplemental, it's something that comes along with other sources, text sometimes. And there are some times when it's very frustrating when you're reading an archive and you hear a mention of a photograph that nobody thought was important enough to archive with the documents that they're talking about. So really not knowing where to begin from that early stage of my research, I just kind of recorded everything. There's no real natural depository for this material. Or in some cases, there's not even an understanding of it, like I mentioned, as being a viable source of history. And so I kind of started my own collection out of that and talking to people, talking to initially it was, different families in Lagos. And then I expanded from there actually to that National Archives in the UK, the National Archives in Nigeria and about the Herbert Macaulay collection. There's actually a Phillips collection also in the DK library that's incredibly rich. And just started to kind of build, folders and files in my Google Drive of like things that were interesting and sharing things that way. And over time, I've sort of realized that, the way to get at some of these lesser recorded materials is actually through material culture. So I've been looking at postcards, I've been looking at newspapers, I've been looking at just the kind of the more ephemeral material culture that, comes along with some of this history that we sort of stumble into, but don't really know what to do with. And so, yeah, I've also been been very, very lucky to have folks who see things and contact me, people like Chris Geary, people like Karen Barber, who has helped me like really think about print culture in a different way, print culture and visual culture together and the convergence of that. People like Kristen, who have been really great with like being just interventions or interlocutors in thinking about and helping me think about how to understand the visual with what I'm seeing and what I'm reading in a very text-rich history. And, you know, I'm really excited about this conversation because I'm interested actually in what Bilikis is doing in Lagos and things like LASRAP that are able to sort of bring these conversations together and bring us together as scholars. And, you know, I'll just end with mentioning something that Kristen mentioned in our last conversation, which is this idea that, you know, not to co-opt LASRAP's mission, but the idea that, you know, it could be a center where, you know, scholars could actually come together and share their information and share ideas and, you know, record what we're each doing so that we have some place to go to actually say, okay, this is who's doing what. You know, that kind of conversation could actually expand our personal networks beyond personal networks into really, really rich resources for everybody. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. I'm not only the chair, but also a panelist. So I'll say a little bit about what brings me to this conversation. One thing I want to say is that it's interesting to learn from Susan that for a couple of decades before you came, that the High Court archives hadn't really been researched and used. Because when I came, when I was using High Court archives, I want to say 2016, your name came up a couple of times and in different ways. In some ways, it functioned almost as a way to kind of restrict my access, like to say, Susan Rosenfeld, Dr. Rosenfeld is working in these archives. So no, you can't, you know, you can't just do that work in those archives. But then also, eventually I was given permission. And I think it's also because, again, you had already been working in those archives. So historians had been visiting and there was now a practice of that worked against maybe the suspicion or the whatever the barrier was, but the barrier had been broken, you know, by you in a sense, and so that also inadvertently ended up helping me. So there were those were two responses, I think, that where your name was invoked. I just want to let you know that. But then, how do I come to this? I mean, the project that I have been working on is trying to collect, you know, family history archives. And my conviction when I started the Ecopolitan Project was that a lot of the kinds of sources I'm interested in about personal experiences, personal migration, and also family memories of migration are privately held and would not be collected in any kind of state archive and that if I could, you know, take advantage of living in the 21st century and use the powers of the internet to crowdsource the vast diaspora of people who have connections to Lagos, that I would somehow be able to generate a collection of family history records, personal family history records that are related to my research interests, which have to do with migration to Lagos in the 19th century. So that's what brings me to this panel as well. I'm trying to think about beyond the technology of digitizing, are there other uses of technology that might help us in the project of archiving or collecting or collating, crowdsourcing Lagos history. Okay, next we go to Professor Matt.
Thank you all. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be with you today. Each one of you has, within the last 3 or 4 years, helped me in my research by sharing documents and by sharing knowledge. So I feel deeply indebted to you all. I had the further privilege of tuning into the session the first session, I think, of the pre-conference when Ms. Adebi Abeola, may I call you Belekis? You surely may call me Kristen. I think it's easier to say first names sometimes. In any case, in which Belekis and her colleagues participated, and I know Abosede was also there because she shared some chats. And I learned so much from that session. It has shaped how I've thought about approaching today's conversation. I will just speak to Bosie's question, what brings me to the conversation, and what work do I feel particularly called to pursue at this time. When I began my research in Lagos back in the 1970s, I wanted to investigate questions that were then new in the discipline of history. They aren't new now, 45, almost 50 years later, but they were new then. And I particularly was looking for sources that would enable me to write the history of peoples who are normally, or had then normally been left out of the study of the past: women, children, enslaved people, sometimes poor and dispossessed people. And that was true despite the fact that my first book really focused on elites. And so I did work in the archives in Ibadan, at the University of Ibadan, at the University of Lagos, and other what we might think of as archives. But I did a lot of oral history, talked to many people, and that's often where I began my research on families, including women. And B, I cast the net wide looking for sources where I could get information about people who didn't necessarily show up in the colonial archives. And other sources in formal archives. So I went to the court records, and I will just note that before I got there, Tony Hopkins had worked in them, and I've been in conversation with him the past year or so. He's now finishing up a book on the merchants of Lagos, the subject of his dissertation, and he has notes from the records. He's the only person I know who has records from volume 1 of the Ikoyi. So I worked in lots of records that were not in personal hands and not in official archives, but were in, still public offices in charge of different kinds of business in Lagos State. Over the course of my career, I've become increasingly aware of how perishable all of those records are. And when I think about the research that all of you are doing that involve using, other and more innovative kinds of archives from the urban environment itself, from the kind of work that Bosie is doing, from the kind of work that Buki is doing with images and objects, the awareness of fragility, perishability becomes even more acute. I've created quite an archive over the course of my career. The records that I created pre-digital age are actually in better shape than the records I've created post-digital age, because I never had any training in how to organize digital materials. So, you know, my archive is pretty vast, and it's also sort of in a shambles. I mean, there's a huge amount in it, but when I go, for others to access information in it ain't gonna be easy, because I'm afraid I'll never have the time to really get it in order before I die. And so I'm really thinking about, I feel my biggest work at this stage in my life is to help younger scholars, to help anybody who's involved in institution building, to give back and pass on. And yet I don't quite know how to do that. In the program on Tuesday morning, Belle Keese and the other professional archives talked about relationships. And I'm aware of how complex the landscape of relationships is in archiving and doing archival work. And Belle Keese spoke of giving back. And so I find even thinking about how to give back, what we as individuals, how we as individual scholars can interface with the professionals, can cooperate with the Lagos State Records and Archives Bureau and other official archives. I mean, there's a lot there that needs to be considered. And I guess the last, I've spoken too long, but you know, the last issue I'll raise that deeply concerns me at this stage is the question of sustainability. I mean, they're questions of goals, priorities, what's most urgent, where do we start? But then how do we make our work sustainable? How do we deal with the question of sustainability in the creation of our personal archives? And then how do the professional archives in cooperation with us wrestle with questions of sustainability? So much has changed over the course of my career, even in the digital age. I have electronic resources that, you know, now are obsolete. And so, you know, so we need to think about best practices for ensuring that digital platforms we use and in which we invest don't become obsolete, or what to do when they do become obsolete. So that's kind of where I'm coming from right now. And I'm just so glad to be here with all of you, because you're doing such innovative and important work, and you're the future. You and
to serve Lagos heritage, just ensuring that we collect and keep Lagos heritage. And then the second goal is to be a regulator for how we, you know, MDAs, ministries, departments, and agencies of the Lagos state government manage our records and our archives. The unfortunate incident of the Igboshere High Court attacks was, you know, was very unfortunate, and it was a big learning point, because you know, we've seen that these are things that, you know, if not properly treated and protected, could be lost. So we are very, very awake to that fact. You know, my job is to, you know, and that's one of the things, I'm here very humble, here humbly asking, you know, all the, you know, scholars that are here to please share your records with us. You know, we know that, like I said earlier, that what we have is not complete. And there are so many people that would benefit from having all this information in one place. You know, we go around looking for opportunities, you know, from people to give us these records. You know, a lot of records that, and historical information for Lagos State is oral, or it's, you know, in private hands, you know, and there's a lot of work that we are doing there. But if, you know, like I said, anyone wants to, you know, partner with us to donate their records to LASFRA, we will be super happy about that. But I think going forward, because we are also aware that, there's a future. So going forward, the next 50, 100 years, whatever records are generated now also need to be properly kept. So we're currently doing one of the big things that we're doing. When I first came into LSRAP a couple of years ago, we had less than 20 archivists within the Lagos State Civil Service, which is grossly inadequate. So where the governor recently approved a revamp of our archives, and we are currently building capacity, human capacity, to ensure that we have trained archivists within every MDA that understands how records should be kept. Because I've seen some cases where you go into certain places and the way the records are kept is not ideal. And that's going to pose a problem for historians in the future if those records are not if they're degraded or if they're destroyed. So what we're trying to do now is to, first of all, create human capacity, make sure that we have enough people in the right places that know what to do, that understand how to archive records. And then we're also organizing archives within various MDAs, so ensuring that those records are properly kept in the right way. And then finally, we can then look at digitizing our records. So currently at LSRAP, we're about 50% done with digitizing our own internal records. So if you come into LSRAP and you wanted to look at, search for something, you wouldn't have to wait for someone to go into the repository and dig through. You can actually just do a full text search and see quickly and what is there. But like I mentioned earlier, we know that what we have within LSRAP is grossly inadequate. It's not enough. So even if you were to come, it would definitely be, LSRAP is going to be only one point of contact for you, because you would have to go to many other places to make your research complete. So one of the things that I look at, as for me, my job is to make sure that whoever is researching, because we are also providing research services to the Lagos State government. So we want to make sure that whatever information we have is good. But also, if a historian is looking for information on Lagos State, they don't have to go to so many places to find information. They could just be in one place and then they can get everything. And so right now, what we try to do is, we use our own local, our own network to say, okay, what kind of topic are you looking for? We know this person, we know that person, go here, go there, we can write a letter for you, but that's not ideal. We definitely want to make sure that everything is in one place so that when you come, you know what you can get access and it's easy for you. So I'll also stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting to hear what's happening at LSRAP. And it also sounds from what everyone has just said that, the historians have records, but we don't have like a systems, and the archive has systems, but doesn't have records. That is, so how can we, there's a clear potential synergy here. So the follow-up question I want to ask has to do with one that was offered by panelists. And this has to do with maybe expanding a little bit on the material logistical methods that we're using. What kinds of tools have we been using to record these archives, to record the materials that we work with, whether they are documentary materials or visual materials, or even objects. Can we talk a little bit about the tools that we've been using? And maybe a second question that picks up on something that Professor Mann said about sustainability. So I've heard a few people mention the overwhelming amounts of things that they have and the challenges with sustaining the work of organizing it, right? We are all scholars, we have a full-time job. Archiving is not our full-time job, it is something else that we're doing. So there will definitely be challenges of sustainability when you try to combine the two. So two questions. One, what are the tools we've been using or trying to use or thinking about using? in our collecting practices or in our organizing practices? And two, what kinds of issues of sustainability are coming up for you? Thank you, Susan.
Same order, okay. So for me, I've thought a lot about, because my work sort of follows individuals, but also tries to understand their interactions with one another and with the larger community of Lagos. I'm really interested in sort of how to link digital files with certain individuals so that you can follow them across archives. So I've thought a lot about this in terms of the Voyages database, which is yet another sort of digital tool. So I guess sort of as an overarching qualifier, because my sources are primarily documents, I've sort of thought about how to link them, right? And because I've sort of digitized them, i.e. taken photographs of them, right, as I've gone along, I keep thinking about how can we sort of link people across these archives, both in Lagos and also as they move, right? I mean, I think this is something that a lot of us are interested in is mobility. And people are often not stationary in Lagos their entire lives, and they show up in other places in the region, they show up in other places in the world, right? So how do we sort of trace individuals, and how do we create methodologies and digital practices that allow us to do that and sort of create these essentially cradle to grave biographies out of documents that actually, you know, I sort of imagine it as you give everybody a particular identifying number, right? And you can click on that number and a list of documents comes up that people can sort of contribute to, right? So this could, Abosede, this could incorporate in, you know, some of the interviews and sort of personal suitcase archives that you're dealing with, right? This could incorporate in materials from more traditional archives, but really sort of creating this collaborative repository where based on subject or individuals, we could really sort of continue to add to the histories of people that would help historians, but also descendants of those people to have documents, right, for them to use. I will stop there.
Thank you. Ademide.
Sure. So I'll turn on my camera again for this part. So this is such an exciting panel to be part of. And it's actually making me think about all the ways that I've done things that are not systematic, but more driven by what I've encountered and what I've been interested in. So for me, as somebody who's perhaps not so much interested in personal biographies, but more about how people use space and where they lived. And, you know, I have a background in architecture and technology, so I'm really interested in space and the environment and how people used their city, or as Bosde described earlier, how they destroyed it. So what I really want is to be able to excavate these visual narratives, understand what Lagos was like. You know, a lot of the histories we read either neglect the environment or condemn it entirely until something newer comes, like, you know, the Portuguese architecture or the colonial infrastructure. So a lot of and when I started doing research, I was mostly taking pictures. So I guess I went on this collection mania. So I've got probably thousands of pictures, not only of documents, but every historical artifact I've been able to find that is in place in Lagos, used by somebody. You know, I've collected records from conferences, exhibitions. I spent a long time collecting newspaper material, I mean, when you look at these things, there's so many descriptions in place, come to this place to get this thing. And of course, my primary interest is in maps. I find maps everywhere, from very large maps that you could probably sleep on to very small maps tucked away in all kinds of places. So I have this very varied collection. And because I'm really interested in looking at, so for instance, a lot of people will write about the prisons in Lagos, but I've been able to find, let's say, documentation of the prisons as they were built in the 19th century and how they were compared to Glover's stables and all these things. So that I find all of these really fascinating things that people write about, but they don't imagine, hence the title of my book. So one of the things I spent a lot of time thinking, like Susan has done, like, if a person is interested in something in particular, part of what I started doing was, because I also collect I've also collected material into the 20th century, which is outside my primary interest. I started putting things online, thinking about new maps of old Lagos, because we will often see primary sources devoid of any context. So I started trying to tell these stories, like, about the tramway, about different things. People will talk about their struggles, and all of this I've tried to visualize. So what I'm doing right now is I found a new software called Notion, which allows you to categorize, tag things. And like I said, it's opaque to most people apart from myself. But basically, I'm able to connect story, place, and time, and people, and really try to think about, okay, if I want to write about Olobo or something like that, what are the images I have? What are the descriptions I have? What are the texts I have? And so I'm building these, I don't know how to describe it, but basically I have a collection of material clustered around different sites in Lagos, from the churches to the creeks to buildings even. And it's a little bit uneven, but I've been thinking about ways to, and I actually use this tool for teaching too, because you can actually make these databases visual. So people can actually sort through it by the keywords that I use. And so also because I'm interested in Lagos Island and using the city as an archive itself, I'm actually linking this to contemporary map in my project. So with sustainability, I guess I'm hoping that things being publicly accessible on the internet will be the most sustainable way, because like Kristen mentioned, there are things I used 10 years ago that are no longer compatible with my computer now. So I'm trying to figure out ways that, if things can live online, as long as I have permission to share and all of those things are there and the system is simple, maybe I'll share a link to Notion when I'm done. Then a person can organize things or look through them themselves without having to try to understand all the things in the background. So I've stopped really building these stories that are interpretive and more just linking things together. I'll stop there.
Okay, so it sounds like there was definitely a shift from maybe a more robust practice, which was to add these stories, to something more sustainable, which is just to add the links. So that's part of the sustainability story. I hear Bukola next. Sorry about the noise.
Yeah, this is a really great conversation. I'm really enjoying hearing what everybody's doing. And it's making me actually rethink my response from the initial time you asked the question to now. So I'm going to try to pull together some of what I've been thinking. So for me, I think I'm interested in biographies in terms of biographies of photographers, but I'm also simultaneously really interested in practices over time, like how practices of image making and practices of photography are changing as we are, seeing these images. And so for me, it's not just tracing individuals' trajectory or career trajectories, it's also kind of seeing similarities and patterns over many different periods of time. And so it's a strange kind of categorization that you have to do mentally in terms of how you organize these materials in your own archives and in your own mind, because I'm not sure that anybody could actually really make sense of all the files that I have on my computer right now. I try to kind of make sense of them in different ways on my own and try to kind of keep my thinking kind of fresh around it. And so I've found it really difficult to land on any particular software. I mean, for all of the issues of sustainability that you all have mentioned as well. So let me just backtrack a little bit in terms of the images. So one of the things that's really interesting about working with visual materials is that, like all of you, I'm taking pictures of them, right? But I find myself in the archive taking pictures of pictures. And so it's a very kind of meta moment where I'm also kind of thinking about the experience of image making as I'm making the image itself. So for me, it's not just about the content of the image, it's also about the process of making the image. And so there are multiple layers of sort of engagement in the archive that I have to kind of think about. But to kind of make sense of what I'm seeing in the archive, and also to make sense of kind of where to go in archives that often don't bother to record images in systematic ways, I think one thing that has really helped me is really, in terms of a tool or a strategy, is really thinking about processes of loss, right? Really trying to understand how loss happens and where it happens in order to sort of figure out where I can intervene in it, right? Where to go that you might not otherwise think to go. So for instance, I can think of a few examples where I've seen images in postcards and then had to backtrack to kind of figure out when that postcard was taken. If the image is really in that terrible condition, I've been able to kind of trace it back to an engraving in a newspaper or something like that, that's around the same time, that was created around the same time period. It's very kind of tedious work, but it kind of works through the same multimedia functions and multimedia processes that I think Ademide was just talking about in terms of like how you can connect different materials over different time periods. And also what Susan was talking about in terms of how you create kind of digital markers, digital historical markers of, in my case, not individuals, but of images, right? And yeah, I think I'm kind of getting muddled here. I'm not sure if what I'm saying is making sense. But to kind of land the plane, I think that one of the really, really interesting things is, for me, has been thinking about how I'm creating and sort of adjusting and evolving my processes of archiving at the same time that I'm trying to navigate these archives and trying to kind of understand where my own processes might be improved by what I'm seeing in the archives that I'm visiting and how I'm interacting with those archives. And so I'm just going to stop there. I'm not sure if it's starting to make sense to people or if it's making less sense.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I think that what one gathers, that's a very meticulous process, but also a very idiosyncratic process. And, so not only may it be not that legible to someone else, but maybe 10 years from now, if you are done with the project, you leave it for some time, you come back to it, how much will you be able to understand what you were doing back 10 years ago? So in terms of myself, I mean, I also have been click happy. I've been taking photographs of documents mostly. And I'm satisfied with my system of organizing the documents. I file them by the archive that they came from, and then I group them by the archive that they came from into different files, and then I try to label each one according to like the file that it came from, things like that. So my technology on that score is fairly simple. The project, the Ecopolitan project, I will have to say that has changed so many times, not on the surface, because it always looks more or less the same. We've changed the website a few times from the outside, but on the inside, in terms of its purpose, its function, its potential, it has changed so much for me. Crowdsourcing, my initial crowdsourcing project was probably more ambitious than it should have been. I asked a million questions to anyone who came to the page. And so I had to really rethink, what can be asked, in a digital format. No one wants a long survey, they want a short survey. Another thing that came up for me, I think, is, the issue of basically asking people about family history records. You know, there's a intense culture of privacy and secrecy, and which is, you know, legitimate, that I think I had not really fully had an appreciation for, a strategy for dealing with, or a robust enough strategy for dealing with online. So there's that. And then ultimately for me, just keeping up with, you know, to do anything via social media, you have to be constantly feeding it and constantly engaged. And as I said earlier, that's not my full-time job. You know, it's one of the research methods that I was pursuing for this project, but this is not the full project. So sustainability on that score became a problem for me. I really was just like, I can't keep up with this. I can't keep doing this. And I remember seeing an interview with Vincent Brown, who is a historian at Harvard University, who works on Caribbean digital mapping, Caribbean anti-slavery history, etc. But he has really impressive, really robust digital history projects. And he talked about the team of people that he has working on it, and how he's like the historian, he has the historical questions, he knows what he's interested in, but he doesn't have the expertise or to do all of the different parts. And so he has a team, he assembled a team, and that's how the work gets done. And I thought to myself, you know, when I heard about that, or I think maybe he had an article about it, or he had a video where he was talking about it. It sounds so common sense when you hear it, but it makes me think about the fact that a lot of us are presuming to work as individuals on our full-time job as a historian, writing and thinking about questions, and also on this full-time job of being an archivist, and then for those who are doing digital archives, on being a technologist and all of it. It's unsustainable, it's not possible. So so increasingly, I am thinking I need to assemble a sustainable team. So, Kristen?
Gosh, you know, fruitful interventions from all of you. I'm not going to start with the question of tools, because tools are not necessarily my strength, though I will circle back to it. But I wanted to, there's some other issues I wanted to talk about, that things that you have said connect with. Buki's comment about processes of loss. I've been doing work over time, but particularly this year, that has increased my awareness of the multiple places where information of particular kinds exist, or where material in archives is, if not preserved, referenced. I'll just take the Igbo High Court as an example. In part, in the aftermath of the incident last year, in which the records were certainly damaged, if not destroyed. And Melikis, will you please give us an update on what's going on with the Igbo High Court? I'd love to hear that. I started looking for, all right, where else can we get a handle on what was going on in the judiciary? And so I became more conscious of, for example, the publication in the press of judicial documents on a regular basis, going back to the Anglo-African in the 1860s. Later on, not just the publication of the docket, but the discussion of cases. Now, I'm not taking the time to compare the discussions in the press with my notes on particular cases, but that would be an interesting project. And it occurs to me, you know, if we were to put the images and the notes that we have among ourselves, and that some other people have too, together, and place them alongside what exists in the press, we wouldn't have, we couldn't redress the full loss of the damage or the destruction of the Igbo Sheri High Court record, but we could preserve for the future the possibility of research with judicial records. And I've not yet taken the time to go back to the government gazettes. Of all the official records, I've worked least with government gazettes, and they are just a rich repository, but I've never spent enough time with them. So I'd like to go back to the government gazettes and see the extent to which they document what was going on in the courts from the 1860s going forward. And the same thing is true. More recently, I've been working on baptism records, and right now I'm working on Catholic baptism records. And I've been able, thanks to information I got from Abosede about an archive that exists in Ireland of the Society for African Mission, baptismal and other records, which are themselves duplicates of materials in Rome. There are transcripts of those documents still in the church in Lagos. And seems to me there's one, oh yes. Then somebody in Ouida at some point in the past created a record, created a baptismal record. And there's overlap between the records in Lagos and the records in that Ouida source, which Lisa Earle Castillo and Luis Nicolau Parez were able to digitize at a point in the past. So if you just think about the Catholic baptism records, there are 3 or 4 or 5 sort of duplications of those records. And that is sometimes the case with archival materials. And I think it's worth becoming more aware of, becoming more conscious of the multiple places where overlapping material exists because of the processes of losses that Buki referred to. And well, one other comment I'm going to make. Vince Brown's team, like all of you, I'm trying to create a robust archive and do robust research that links people and that links particular questions or processes across multiple archives. One thing I've done is to work with a collaborator in Brazil and create a database of cartas de alforria, manumission papers that we're now pushing back toward 1800. So we'll have a database that goes from 1800 so far to the 1860s. I'd like to push it forward to 1888. There are just 2 of us working on that. We don't have a team. And nor do I have a team that helps me do anything else. Now, this is confidential. We're all women. I only know one woman who has a team. I know many men who have teams. If you think about David Eltis, he's brilliant at assembling teams. If you think about Paul Lovejoy, he's been brilliant at assembling teams. If you think about what's going on in collaboration between Michigan State and now Darrell Williams, who's moved to Riverside, they've got a great team, a great big grant. When I interact with them, I don't communicate with them, I communicate with their assistants. I regard it as a failing of my own that I don't have the executive and organizational skills to assemble a team. But I also think that there are ways in which it may be gendered. And that might be worth our thinking about. Gals, I'd like to be part of your team. I want you on my team. But the reference to Vince Brown's wonderful team, for which I commend him, leads me to ask the question, well, why don't I have a team? Why don't we have teams as women? So that's just a private question among us.
Semi-private, me, the five of us and the LSA.
Yeah, that we are recorded here. This is recorded. It's all right. It's all right. I'll live with what I've said. I've directed it at myself, not at others. I've celebrated the men who do it and said, why not? Why don't more women seem to do it? Tools. I've too found it very, very useful always to create a record by archive and then by source or fonte within archives. And that has served me over the course of my career. I can often remember documents. I don't know where they are, but I can remember the archive where I got them. And so, for 50 years, I've been able to go back to my collection, always organized by archive and source. But in addition, back in the day when I was doing hard copy, just making notes on the typewriter or my longhand, I took carbon paper with me to the archives and I always made 3 copies. I filed one by source, and then I would have 2 copies that I could file by subject matter. And at the top, I would use keywords. At the top of the right-hand top, I'd put the reference. Left-hand top, I'd put keywords, a series of keywords. And then I would, choose the most essential keywords. And I had 2 copies that I could file. Now, in the digital age, we can search, by subject matter. So those duplicate copies that could be filed by subject matter are not so critical. But still, the question that so many of you have raised, Susan has raised, and all of you have raised is, how do we trace connections across archives? I love the possibility of having a digital platform that would better enable me to do that. Notion sounds really interesting. I'm an old dog. I don't know if I'll ever learn that new trick, but so I don't have a good tool. I spend an awful lot of time moving among sources. I'm interested in somebody, so all right, here are several different sources where I think they might appear, and I just navigate back and forth across them. Having those sources in digital format is a huge, huge help, but it doesn't stand in for or replace some kind of a tool that would allow me, that would trace those connections for me digitally or technologically. I'll stop there because I've taken enough time.
Thank you so much. It's making me think that being able to, the digital is helpful for organizing large amounts of material, but then you end up with thousands and thousands of images or thousands and thousands of documents. They're organized, but are you going to look at any of them? All of them. Whereas the method that you were trained in, and some of us were trained in, but not the young ones, where you have to deal with the documents one by one by one, is really great for drilling down on the content and what's in it, because you have to spend that kind of time with it. Bilkis, do you want to say anything on this last question? Because I'm going to next just throw out a question that anyone can jump in on, so that we can have a more organic conversation. Bilkis, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think, on our side, I think we're different because we, like you said, we're more of so that's our job to organize. So, I think it's kind of not probably relevant. So I'll stop and see what questions you have for me.
Okay. Sustainability might still be a question, but I think we have 20 minutes. It's till 9:30, right? The next question I have really is inspired by the conversation that was at the first day of the pre-conference, Dr. Toja Oko's panel that she chaired. And several themes emerged from that conversation, such as, who are these archiving projects for? That panel was all the members on the panel were archivists in the Nigerian civil service, let's say that, right? So National Archives, State Archives, and directors of those archives. And so some of the questions that I heard there were, who are these archives serving? What does the provenance of funding for projects within the archives What role does it play in determining the audience? So if you get French funding, does the archive end up serving more French scholars and students? Who ends up using these archives, and how can more Nigerian community members be brought into the archive, into the research universe? How does the culture of secrecy in politics and in society impact the work of collecting and archiving? So these to me were all questions that circled around the theme of access, and access has come up for us in a different kind of way. But can we all speak a bit, or anyone who wants to jump in, speak on the question of access and how it comes up in your own work, in your own efforts? What kinds of questions about access are you thinking about? And what kinds of strategies are you maybe adopting or attempting or imagining to address questions of access as you understand them? Anybody can jump in on this point.
Okay, I'll jump in. I think our situation is a bit unique because we deal with classified files and also public files, and people that that we serve, the MDAs that we serve, have to feel comfortable sharing their documents because some of those documents are actually classified and are not supposed to be consumed. So there's that issue as well. So but we do have a robust system for managing all these things. And, one of the big issues, I think, is just creating awareness. Unfortunately, LASRAB is not that well known. We're just pushing, our name, even within some parts of the government. Some people may just be hearing about us for the first time. So we have a big job of raising awareness and letting people understand what we are here for. And kind of teach people that this is actually something that is here as a service. And I'm pretty excited because now that we are pushing people into various MDAs, so there's going to be basically LASRAB, ambassadors within various ministries. Then there's somebody there every day that's talking about records management and talking about the importance, and collecting these records, because one of the things that we do is that if we see that something is a non-current record that is not being used, our job is to assess and make sure that if it's of archival value, take it into the archives. But with regard to access, we look at number one, people that want to come and research within LASRAB, ensuring that they have a productive experience. So what do we have? What are the things that we have? So I think creating enough, so we have to be everything for everybody, which is almost impossible, but that is our job. So making sure that everybody that comes into LASRAB can get something useful, while they're researching. But I think my one of the things that I've learned is, it's also kind of also us going online too. So we try to do, some things on social media, to kind of push what we have to see what resonates. And if there's something that resonates, then we can actually drill deeper and go and look for those things. So it's not very, it's actually, a big part of our job is going into dusty rooms and packing the bags of paper and going through that. That is really a big part of our job. I think one thing that I've seen that is a big problem is, we know historians need data, but then we've also found out that even children within Lagos do not have much information about Lagos history, and so we talk about access for historians and a particular community, but then just the general public, there's really no, people are not really aware of history. So I think that's something I wanted to bring on board as well, is that, and it's very unfortunate, but seeing that, there is a big gap, between what we've collected, what we've all researched, and then the general public. Thank you.
I want to jump in on this too, actually, because it makes me think that, besides historians, one person that lawyers also use archives a lot. And, lawyers reach out to us and ask us, what did you have on this, on that? So they should be going straight to the archive, but maybe they do both. But in terms of, for me, one thing that comes up when I think about access is I was trying to, through Ecopolitan Project, ask people for family history records. So, and in doing so, part of the bargain is that, you know, I'm not going to just get your records and put them on the internet, right? Like, it is for a very particular research, scholarly research project that will be kept safely by me. But, you know, what dimensions of it you are, so really, if you look at the blog, what's up there are things that are also in official archives. They're not the private archives ones. So, you know, what do you do with, you know, access? Access for me is a question of like how to make my work accessible while protecting the privacy of the source, or protecting the source in a sense. Does that make sense?
I have a couple of thoughts on this as well. So first of all, in terms of thinking about access, and thinking about, you know, my experiences trying to get access, et cetera, which we've all had, right? You know, with LASRAB being run as part of the Lagos state government, how does access work for everybody, right? So are these things just free online? Do you actually have to go to Lagos to access them? How does it work in terms of creating something that's equitable for everybody to be able to access without needing, if you are Nigerian living in the UK, let's say, how do you access that without having to spend a lot of money buying a plane ticket and going and staying to use these archives in Lagos, right? So is this going to be free? And then how is it self-sustainable, right? So questions like that. And then also in terms of access, I think that at least in the American Academy, the culture of the American Academy and sort of the structure of the American Academy really does not encourage collaboration and sharing, right? We all sort of go and collect these things, and it's our labor and our sweat and our money, and that we've, you know, applied for grants for, and all of this stuff. And as much as we can all say, yes, collaboration is great, right? At the end of the day, tenure and book contracts and all of these things depend on having new stuff to market yourself with, right? That nobody else has. So in terms of putting things just online for everybody, right? How does that make you competitive as a member of the Academy and as an academic? And how do we sort of get around those sort of barriers to collaboration with each other, right?
Great points.
Can you hear me? I can never tell with where I am.
Yes, we can hear you. Yes.
Oh, or Billikis, do you wanna answer the question, or should I just make I wanted to make a couple of points about access.
Please go ahead. Thank you.
Oh, of course. I mean, so for me, Ambassador, these questions that you're raising are among the most painful. You know, Lagos, went to school in Lagos up to the university level. The lack of information, the lack of historical context is so painful and so critical. And because, apart from what is classified, because of these cultures I see, and, you know, not really democratizing information, there's so little that we know. And as somebody who's come back and tried to talk to people, and to have people, when you ask them about history, and then they tell you, you know, they recite the historical material collected by missionaries from the 19th century as sort of indigenous knowledge. And because they're not reading the original sources that, as Kristen has mentioned, have been digitized elsewhere, I think we have a really critical problem with not just public history and the gap that Billy Keith said exists, but also in terms of our education. I mean, I look at, you know, people I know, people's children that I know, they're so little knowledge. I learned most of what I learned about Lagos in America, which is astonishing to me. And it's only because I'm a professional historian that I have access to all of this material, which is what makes it uncomfortable. Because I know people are interested, but we don't write, as Susan said, the pressures of the academy are such that I'm not writing so that I can tell my cousins, look at this incredible thing that happened in the 1860s. For me, being academic has been a process of discover all the time, because so much is just not available. So I think that for us, access is for everyone, and we have to think seriously. And Kristen, you're right, we need a team. Each of us needs our own team so that we can delegate this work and have people do the parts that we can't do, right? We should do the parts we're good at, and others should do the parts they're good at, because our society is trying to do certain things, but without this knowledge, without this information, without all of this, we really are hampering not only ourselves, but our future generations. I'm talking about Nigerians and maybe Lagosians in this sense. So I think we have a critical problem here in terms of not only archiving, but disseminating and speaking and being ready for the disputes. I mean, it's one thing to go into which I try to stay far away from. But I think that we should be able to engage not only academics, but mostly people in the public domain. How we're going to do that, I'm not sure, but we have a real problem with access. And I'll stop by saying that every time I go to the UK archives in Kew, there's a massive amount of people, retirees, young people, they want to know about how their grandfather served, who did this, a culture of open access. So actually, I'm struggling for tables with people who want to learn about something from World War I or World War II. So there's this culture of information and dissemination and speaking that we don't have. So I think there are many levels to this question of access. And for me, this is the most painful part. How can we engage with schools? How can we engage with universities? How can we democratize information so that we can have fuller conversations? Because I think this is what will create the cultures of actually keeping things that are happening now so that the future generations will also have them. I'm sorry.
Thank you very much. You're speaking to the stakes of what we do in our careers. Did anyone else want to jump in on the access question? Okay, yeah, Bilkis.
Thank you. I really love everybody's contributions on this issue. And, I would say, what Ademide said resonates. A lot of times there's really not that many people that are interested in LASRAM on a normal day. It's just, historians that want specific information. But like you said, Ademide, just somebody coming in to learn about their great-grandfather or their grandfather, that is something that is not there. So there is a need for us to actually educate people on learning about their history so that they would appreciate it and they will want to consume. And when I think it's like a virtuous cycle. Once they consuming it and there's a demand, then our archives are going to actually get better because we are getting, people coming in and asking for things. And that makes us better. So I would say that. And then to respond to Suzanne's question in terms of how we will look at sharing information, my goal is, once we are able to digitize everything, all the non-classified documents there will be a simple list that's accessible online. So you can actually just go on a website and just search, and it will show you a list of items. And then you can fill out a form and request for certain things, and they will be sent to you. So that's really, and then for a small fee, because we also have to, one of the things, our goal as a government agency is that we have to generate, funding for the government. So, no matter how small, we would like to also, get something. And then with regard to, this issue of keeping documents because it makes you more marketable as a historian, I respect that. I think that's understandable. But I would also say before people die, make it a habit of donating your records to the archives. There's a gentleman, I think I mentioned it at the earlier panel, that he was 80 something and he had so much records and he was good enough and nice enough to donate his stuff. And now we're able to we've been able to increase our holdings of transportation records in Lagos State. So I would like to just encourage people, even if it's something you need for your career, I understand that that's fine. But then when it's like at the end, please look at us as a place where you actually donate. Thank you.
Just Kristen Mann and Bukola, maybe just 1 minute each. We have just 4 minutes left.
I just want to save time for Belakis to give us an update on the Igbo High Court situation. That's what I wanted to put on the table.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for that. So unfortunately, we lost a lot of historical records during the attacks, which was very sad. So we've lost quite a bit. But thankfully, there are still some records that we have, and we are currently going through them to assess. It's quite a lot. So we don't yet know exactly how much has been lost, but we do know that it was a lot. We are also working on, that's one of the things that we did last year was to convene a conversation around Igbo High Court, is coming together to put together some kind of publication where we can just have everything in one place. Because there's also some older lawyers and older judges that also have information within their records. So we're coming to, putting together a group, like a movement, so that we can publish a book on that. But we're not historians, but we're working on that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bukola?
I can definitely say it in under a minute. So this conversation about access is giving me ideas about my own experiences with trying to get access to particular images and things that aren't necessarily recorded in the archive, and also kind of the question that is in the chat around music and around recordings. So it occurs to me that one of the things that I'm hearing from all the responses of the different people who've spoken is that there's a kind of this tension between documents and also the oral history, right? That folks tend to rely on our oral history, or we find a lot more interest and a lot more information being exchanged through oral history than through documents. And there might be a way here to kind of bridge that by expanding or exploring oral recordings, right? Oral records. I think that's something that is more and more common, particularly in American archives. And I think there's a real potential here for oral history projects that might bring in a different kind of information source into this conversation about Lagos history. So that's what I was going to say. And Vicky, email me because I have some ideas about the question about music.
Thank you. So, our conversation continues because what we've really done here is discovered much more about each other. And our next steps need further conversation. A couple of questions I was going to ask were about, how can those, is it time, a lot of documentary records on Lagos history, musical records, visual records are outside of Nigeria. Is it time to formulate restitution principles or restitution ethic to guide our scholarly collecting practices, or for future scholars? And then also, how can scholars and artists collaborate in a more systematic way with Lagos archives like LASRAB for archiving public Lagos history? Maybe in ways that we can incorporate into our teaching for future generations. We weren't trained in these things, but it doesn't mean that nobody going forward can be trained minimally in these principles. So maybe we'll save that for our next conversation. I want to thank all of our panelists and the LSA and our director of LASRAB, Ms. Bilakis Adebiyi-Abiola, for joining us. And I look forward to our next gathering. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you for organizing.
Thank you. Thank you.